at the UNDP and the coordinator of the UN Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction, GAR report, producing 5 editions of the GAR between 2009 and 17. Over to Dr. Maskry.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. So welcome to this session, which is called Risk Assessments and Resilience Metrics, Making Long-Term Investments Amidst Deep Uncertainty. Well, I could also say insecurity right now as well. Basically, the way we're going to run the session, we have 2 great presentations coming up. The first one is from Gabriel Bernal, who's the Chief Technical Officer in ICDRI Risk Intelligence. And he'll be followed by Nicholas Chow, who's a PhD student in the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. Now, after each presentation, we have 2 people coming in to provide comments. We have Juliet from Arup. Welcome, Juliet. And we have Katarzyna as well from the Green Climate Fund. So after each presentation, I'll be giving a few minutes to both our panelists to make some comments. And then after the second presentation of the second round of comments, I will then be actually fielding some questions, 1 to each of the presenters and 1 to each of the panelists. Now, unfortunately, Gabriel let us know last night. He has a very complicated family situation to resolve today. So he'll be leaving after his presentation, and Mabel Marolanda, who's based in Abu Dhabi, is very, very kindly offered to sort of step in and field the question which was going to go to Gabriel. So we have 4 questions, 1 to each of the presenters and 1 to each of the panelists, and then we're going to finalize with some Q&A from the audience, which I will field to whoever I feel is most appropriate to answer the question. So that's basically the run of the show today. What I'm now going to do is, without any further ado, ask Gabriel Bernal if he could give us his presentation. So Gabriel, you've got around 14 or 15 minutes, please, for your presentation. And thanks, Gabriel, again, for making this effort to join us, because I know you have a very difficult situation to resolve once this event is over. So over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Andrew. Happy to be here. Greetings from all of you. Let me share my screen. Please let me know that is that is shown. Okay. So okay, the objective of this presentation is to share with you what is going to be the GIDI. GIDI is the acronym for the Global Infrastructure Risk Model and Resilience Index, which is being developed in the framework of the ICDRI flagship report by a consortium of international partners, one of which is ICDRI Risk Intelligence. So first, let me give you some general key points about what we think GIDI is. First of all, GIDI will be both a metric and a modeling framework to account for disaster risk in the infrastructure systems that support socioeconomic activities of the world. This will account for disaster risk in a fully probabilistic way, which is important because we want to deliver probabilistic metrics and to incorporate climate change through imprecise probability estimates. This is kind of a novelty here because usually these type of models, which are, as you know, called catastrophe risk models, are stationary and are based on probability estimates. However, when you incorporate, or when we incorporate climate change, which exhibits deep uncertainty, then we need to shift into imprecise probability estimates to provide a full and transparent view and metrics of the risk that the infrastructure systems are facing. So this is very relevant for the GIDI. Also, it will incorporate socioeconomic context through variables, through indicators, in order to aggravate risk and to fully capture its complex nature. This is very relevant because disaster risk, as you know, depends on the context in which the events, the disasters are occurring, and this is something that the indicator will incorporate. Furthermore, we will provide an operational picture of risk that will help to improve risk knowledge and resilience. This is because an overall landscape of risk will be useful for comparisons and rankings among countries, so we get a sense of comparison for the whole world. It, of course, incorporates events that have not occurred yet. This is customary in catastrophe risk models. So we're not based entirely only on historical information, but we will be simulating events of different natural hazards and see if those occur, what will happen to the infrastructure systems of the world. This is something that works with a specific mathematical background, mathematical framework. So we can go from the global scale, which is the case of this indicator and the first iteration for the flagship report. And then we can use that same information and the same approach and mathematical framework, the same arithmetic, to go into any other resolution level. And this is something important because the countries will be required to carry out, or they must carry out in the future, assessments with a higher resolution at subnational and local levels that will be able to support, that will be helpful to support decision making and risk management at the local level. So the assessment is for the global level. It's a coarse grain approach, but the mathematical framework that we're using is suitable to be incorporated and used for any other resolution level. Now, in this case, we will be covering different infrastructure sectors: power, highways and railways, transportation, water and wastewater, communications, oil and gas. We will be also updating a previous model, the global risk model that was used for the global assessment report versions of 2015 and 2017. So we will be able to incorporate other infrastructure like education and health infrastructure. So the model works like this. We have an infrastructure system, which we build a model. The model of the system is based on an exposure that, in rigor, is a network of interdependent assets through which some commodity flows or some service is rendered. This means that the type of damage that we expect from natural events is the direct loss to physical assets or the profit loss due to changes in the balance of demand and offer. Now, in this case, of this first iteration of the flagship report, we will be focusing only on direct losses as a first step to fully quantify the risk of the infrastructure systems. What we want to do is evaluate the performance of the system to external disturbances, which are the hazards. We will be covering in this work earthquake, tsunami, landslide, drought, flood, and tropical cyclones. All these hazards will be modeled using state-of-the-art physical models with an event-based approach, which is very important because we want to see after any event of any nature occurs, what is the effect, what is the level of perturbation that the system is going to be subjected to. Now, the overall is very relevant because vulnerability is going to define how susceptible is the infrastructure to suffering damage once a hazard event is occurring in the territory. Now, given that we are incorporating some hydrometeorological hazards, those hazards will be altered or modified or perturbed by climate change. So this is going to be an input into the model, allowing us to compute losses by event, which is what I just mentioned. After one of these simulated event occurs, we want to see what is the impact to all the infrastructure systems. And at the end, we're going to aggregate everything into risk metrics that are based, of course, in the loss exceedance curve. And from this one, we're going to be delivering any other risk metrics that are relevant to quantify and to communicate risk. Now, since we're using climate change here, we will be looking at different global circulation models. At present, we have around 41 global circulation models that provide us with different information. We will be using the different forcings of those models in terms of the socioeconomic shared pathways defined by IPCC in the Assessment Report 6 that give us a kind of a trajectory of emissions that allow these models to provide a visualization of changes in meteorological variables in the future. We will be working with the ICMIP free dataset. So at any location in the world, we will have some changes of temperature, for example, changes in precipitation and so on, that are going to be giving us an idea of how meteorological variables will be changing in the future if the world follows some specific concentration pathway of greenhouse gases emissions. So this is going to provide us with a set of time-dependent and consistent and physically consistent variations of meteorological inputs. So let's say that we have from these projections the information like that I'm showing in the screen, and we set some future time target, for example, 2100. What the projections are giving us is a variation, a domain of variation of variables like temperature and precipitation. So what we're going to do is to bound the extent of those variations, just like that, to provide some bounds to the model. But to simplify, we're going to provide only 2 bounds of that rectangle or square that you're seeing in the screen. We will be providing only 2 of them. So this implies for us that there will be 3 different climate models in this project. The current or base climate with the base climatology, the base climatology period being from 1990 to 2010. Sorry, to 2020. And 2 climate change bounds that give us 2 different extremes of climate that will provide us different information. And of course, they will perturbate the hazards and therefore the risk derived from those hazards. So this means that we have multiple hazards of multiple events for each hazards. This means we have thousands of possibilities of different events occurring and damaging our systems, which each will imply a different level of perturbance or perturbation, disturbance into the system, a different level of loss. And of course, those will be accompanied by a probability. So we have a loss quantification and a probability of that loss being the result of the occurrence of one specific hazard event. So from this set of losses and probabilities, we then integrate everything into the loss exceedance curve and other metrics like the PML curve or the average annual loss and so on, which are metrics that are well known for catastrophe risk models and that will provide us an idea, and they become like indicators of physical risk that we will be using to create these rankings and comparisons and to quantify and provide a numerical quantification of risk for each country and, of course, at the first subnational level. This means that for all the countries in the world, we will have these metrics computed for their infrastructure systems, covering those sectors that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And also, given that we will use climate change for the hydrometeorological hazards as an input, then we get as an output risk metrics that are time-dependent and imprecise. So for those hazards that are going to be, or that are susceptible to be perturbated by climate change, we will have this type of metrics. Risk metrics provided as intervals and at different time targets. All of these will be computed using the Capra robot platform, which is Ingeniar's engine for disaster risk calculation that covers all the hazards that are incorporated into the project and many more. And this is relevant because maybe for future iterations of this flagship report, it will be possible to incorporate other hazards, maybe other sectors, for example, agriculture, maybe even, why not, ecosystems and environmental risk. And this will all be able to be computed in the same way, following the same mathematical approach to get the same type of metrics. In terms of the context of the evaluation, we will be using a holistic approach for disaster risk assessment and management to provide a modification to the physical risk to try to capture characteristics related to social fragility and lack of resilience that may be important or relevant to communicate and to establish the risk at any particular country. It means that at the end we will get a compound indicator that gives us that accounts for physical risk and also for the context relevant for the infrastructure systems in which that risk is presented or occurring. And everything will be provided in a data platform that can be used by anyone to download information and to get these metrics that are very useful to be used as indicators for different management processes, for example, for quantifying financial instruments, insurance, for example, for quantifying the extent of mitigation strategies and the cost benefit of those strategies, for example, to use as indicators or targets for risk-based or resilience-based design of infrastructure, and so on. So all this information will be provided in this data platform of free access on the web, so that anyone interested or with some responsibility in these issues can access this information and make use of it as needed. This is a team effort of different partners in an international consortium, as I mentioned. And I wanted to say that let's never forget that the path to disaster resilience starts with a good enough risk modeling, a risk modeling that is fit for purpose, and that gives us some peace of mind that our estimates are at least in the right order of magnitude and represent in a sufficient way the problem that we want to represent. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. That was fantastic, and you did extremely well in compressing a lot of complex information in a very short space of time. So I'm now just going to ask our two panelists. You have around 3 minutes each just to give us a very brief initial commentary on what Gabriel's just showed us. So we'll start off with Juliette. So over to you, Juliette, for a few minutes.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much, Gabriel. I don't think in 3 minutes I can really do justice to the level of detail that was presented, but just to pick up on a few things that struck me, and maybe initially your very final comment about the good enough risk modeling, I think really hits the nail on the head. There is a huge need for understanding our risk with everything that we do in Arup around our sort of infrastructure resilience. Step one is understand the system. Step two is understand the risk before anything else follows. And I think the good enough is really important, because sometimes we don't do it in enough detail. Sometimes there's almost more detail than is necessary. So providing this globally consistent framework is really exciting. The fact that it's been going to be freely accessible just gives us this starting point of a consistent and open understanding of the risk. What happens next, I think, is something I'm really excited about. So this to me is the first step on the ladder, and then there's a sequence of continually downscaling in terms of detail, in terms of understanding risk and enhancing resilience. I suppose that's probably my overall reflection. We have to have this first, then we have to do something. We have to make decisions, interventions, policies, processes that will actually make the change, having this information. Something else that you said right at the beginning that I also wanted to pick up on is including the socioeconomic context, massively important. Our physical, technical systems are only one part of the complexity. So I think you've got all the ingredients in there. Congratulations, because I think it's a hugely impressive and also hugely ambitious, and certainly from my perspective, very daunting undertaking that you've set out. So good luck and congratulations. Thanks, Gabrielle.
Thank you very much, Juliet, for those comments. So I'll now go over to Katarzyna. You also have a few minutes to comment on Gabrielle's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me also start to congratulate for immense job being done. And I think also the beauty is that the more people use the same platform of models, the better we might be in getting to the same conclusions. So I think the fact that it is very broad may be very helpful. I would just to pick also on some elements. Firstly, because you have normally two types of uses for this kind of tools. The one is for the high-level decision making, and here you have all the possible direct losses avoidance. But then you also can scale down this kind of models when you need to produce projects and interventions. Now, so I think the fact that these arithmetics, these equations can be used because they are done in the way that can be used on any level, depending what kind of resolution we can get in the future, or maybe resolution from another model as the next step. I think this is very, very important, that you can really take off some of these equations and use later on. So then you have the compatibility from the decision making into their intervention structure. And I would also like to underline the different scenarios and probabilities. This is very often asked for final decision making on investment and also for finance. So this is very crucial also for the second use, which is more for projects. And I would very much like to underline also what Juliet already mentioned, which is about the social economic context, especially coming from Green Climate Fund. For us, it's not only important that there is a resilience in the countries, but that is a resilience for communities that are the most vulnerable. So this element can help to target the right people for the future investment. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Katarzyna, for those kind comments. So we'll thank Gabrielle. I think you have to go off now, Gabrielle, and sort out some complex issues. So we'll thank Gabrielle and leave you. Mabel will come back later in to sort of answer the questions which we're going to go to you. So we're now going to go over to the second part of the session, the second presenter. So this is Nicholas Chow from the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, who's going to talk to us about a complementary initiative, which is a survey we're doing on sort of infrastructure quality and infrastructure governance. Nicholas will explain to us what that's about. But we'll also, I think, it's going to shed light on a lot of the, let's say, non-physical aspects of risk, and will very nicely, hopefully, complement Gabrielle's work when we really pull all this together. So over to you, Nicholas.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I'll get my screen shared here. Can you confirm with me when you can see this? Yep.
We can see it, Nicholas. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, well, I'll start by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Nicholas Chow. I'm the lead researcher on the Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey, and I'm working on this project as part of a team with Professor Jim Hall, working in the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. Thank you, Andrew, for the fantastic introduction. Hearing Gabrielle speak, I think that there's a lot of overlap and a lot of complementarity to the work that we're doing here. And so in today's presentation, I'm going to be talking to you all about what is the Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey, introducing at a high level, what is this work going to look like, and what I hope you can take away from this. I'll move beyond that to talk about the background concepts, the context of the project, and why we are engaging in the project. From there, talk specifically about the survey design, so you'd have an understanding of what the survey is, what the results we hope to achieve are, and where we are in implementation. So without further ado, I think the highlights of the project are really, there are 6 points that I really wanted you to take home from this session. The first one being that the Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey is in fact a survey, and it will be looking at infrastructure across the globe at both the national level and across different infrastructure sectors. So water, energy, transport, and telecommunications broadly. But again, a framework that is going to be able to be applied or cross-applied across many, many different nations. So I think that's really important. Secondly, the focus of this survey will be on the non-physical infrastructure management. Right now in the world, we have a lot of data on geospatial features and how we can design or make decisions around the location of our assets, but there isn't a lot of data out there that talks about the non-physical infrastructure management, things like policies, regulation, enforcement, data availability, and financial and technical capacities. And so that's really what the focus of this survey is going to be. I want to make the point that there are other surveys that have begun this kind of work, things like the Global Resilience Survey or Global World Risk Survey, Global Competitiveness Index. Some of the UN agencies have also engaged in understanding what infrastructure looks like from the management side, but this is the first project that will be at a global level. Our work will build on those previous kinds of surveys and also go further. The survey is intended to be distributed across the internet. So it'll be a web-based survey. Anyone can do it on their phones or their computers, and we'll be translating the survey into 5 different languages. So again, trying to capture as much information as we possibly can across the globe. And the survey will benefit and will capture information from experts. Maybe many of us in the room consider ourselves infrastructure experts in different fields, but also from non-experts, things that I think about for my family, for my sister, for my mother and father who don't work on infrastructure. We'll also be collecting information from them. Different kinds of information that we'll get to, but still the survey will bring both of those views of infrastructure together to hopefully create some insights that are valuable for decision-making farther along the line. Last point is that the Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey will take place across multiple months. In particular, looking into between May and September, we'll be launching different phases, different parts of the survey, and we hope that you'll all engage with the survey and answer the questions. So with that information, you now know what is the Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey. Why are we doing it? Well, I think the key concept, the sort of foundational question that we have is that if you have engaged in resilience planning with infrastructure entities in the past, you may have seen these words before, sometimes called the 5 Rs or the 6 Rs: resilience, redundancy, recovery, reliability, adaptability, and in this case, transformability. And these are sort of the watchwords that are used in resilience planning. Several of the resiliency frameworks use these, but in decision-making process, in reality, on the ground, many decisions are made really focused on risk, redundancy, and recovery. And that's driven by physical geospatial data that describes where our assets exist, how much water can they hold, where are our power lines, and how are they going to be affected by floods. These very physical geospatial data features. We recognize that this geospatial data actually affects maybe about half of these resilience factors, whereas there are entire sections of these pillars of resilience that are affected by the enabling environment that we don't make decisions on simply because we don't always have enough data. And so the motivation of this survey is really to be able to collect some of that data, make it quantifiable, be able to provide data for decision-making, not just in terms of the physical risks, but also in terms of sort of the societal factors that we're going to be considering for infrastructure projects in the future. So I've talked about the enabling environment, but maybe that term is not so familiar to you. And so I'm going to give a little bit of context on the enabling environment. My favorite definition when I've learned about the enabling environment that I've seen is from the Global Water Partnership. They describe the enabling environment as the rules of the game. In reality, the definition that we use is the deliberate governance actions, as well as the unintentional community factors that influence infrastructure planning, design, operations, and service provision. Now, what that means, looking at the diagram to the right, is that we can consider what are the governance structures that influence our infrastructure projects. So things like policy, reporting, schedules, maintenance and standards, enforcement practices. All of these are deliberate governance structures. But we can also consider the non-deliberate, unintentional community factors, things that might look like community environmental groups or unions. These also affect how our infrastructure projects are implemented and how service is provided. And so the enabling environment really is the overlap of these areas that affect how our infrastructure projects are served to our customers. And how can we really think about that? Well, it's such a large and expansive space. The first thing that we can do is really try to simplify it, boil it down into different categories. And so some common categories of the enabling environment that you might see in this work and many others might be things like policy, legislature, regulations, capacities, and societal factors. But as many of you know, especially across different nations, different contexts, different languages, these factors are too simple. These factors themselves have subcategories, all of which we might want to engage with and want to understand and better describe. But really, we have to take part of the challenge of the survey is looking across all these enabling environment factors and finding ways to engage or to translate them into survey questions that we can ask experts and non-experts to better understand the context of their infrastructure development and service provision. So our survey design process, I should start off by saying, is using a core survey methodology. And to spare you the acronyms, the core survey methodology really is looking to understand objects and attributes. And the objects in the case of our analysis are policy features. So it's an intangible object here. These are the policies or the maintenance schedules. And the attributes. What are the attributes of policies that we care about that are relevant to infrastructure? And so we have in our survey a list of all of the attributes that we care about for policies, for disaster preparedness, for financial capacity. And the survey begins to ask questions about all of those. In terms of how we've designed the survey to reach out to individuals, we hope to take a multi-pronged approach. That is, we're going to be engaging in expert sampling that is targeting specifically engineers and experts, but also at the same time, identifying individuals through our partners like ICDRI, and also a social media campaign. Social media campaign is going to be, in particular, an interesting and new approach for us is using LinkedIn to specifically target individuals that work in specific sectors to answer the survey. And the goal of the survey really is to collect thousands of responses certainly in larger countries. And the idea is that we would hope to collect data across all these countries and have enough data to understand the enabling environment for infrastructure in every country. Now, an important question, or sort of the foundational piece for understanding the survey, is that we're going to be taking in survey participants and separating them into experts and non-experts. And we'll ask experts and non-experts different kinds of questions. And so for the experts, we will ask a set of core questions, which all experts will answer. Things like, what country are you responding for? What's your sector of expertise? Is data available in your country for decision-making? What are the kinds of hazards that you see and how often do they occur? And then we'll move away from the core questions into what we call specialist questions. And these questions are for experts that feel that they have a speciality in things like policy, maintenance and standards, accountability and enforcement, disaster response, financial capacity, and institutional capacity. And in the survey, we ask individuals in each of these sectors to answer questions that are very relevant to them, they might have answers for. Again, this survey is designed to capture information that we could never capture using satellites or using any other kind of data collection method. We wouldn't know things about maintenance and standards at different infrastructure levels without asking these experts. And really, in many of these countries, they're the only people that know them. And so we hope to, for the expert side, bring this data together into a database that doesn't exist currently. There is no such database that would describe all this information for decision-making right now. So from the non-expert side, we ask different core questions. We ask questions about the country itself, but also the urban-rural divide. As Gabrielle and I believe Juliet mentioned, the importance of the socioeconomic question. Who is being served and what communities are receiving what kinds of service? So those are our core questions. We then move into questions about service type and service quality. So again, across the water, energy, telecommunications, and transport sectors, we ask individual respondents about what kinds of service do they receive and how often is that service interrupted? How often is it interrupted for maintenance versus how often is it interrupted by climate events? These kinds of questions. And so we have two distinct sets of data. Each set of data here is useful on its own. It tells us something, the first telling us something about how infrastructure systems are managed. And the second set of data tells us about what is the real experience that infrastructure users, non-experts, are seeing in their households. And both of those are significant. And we hope to create from those different kinds of results. The first is a map that looks something like this. And so for our expert surveys, we would hope to have a map that describes, you can pick any country in any nation, and you might say, which nations have stronger policies, or which nations have more policies, which nations have stronger financial institutions or financial capacity. They are more well-resourced, or they see more efficient spending, that is maybe less loss of funding in infrastructure projects. And not only that we would have this data, which in some cases exists across different databases, but we would have this data computed in a way that is consistent across all nations. I think that's where a lot of this value comes in. For the non-expert survey questions, we'd hope to be able to answer questions about service interruptions and system recovery times, and really even around urban and rural divides within nations, what kinds of services are provided to what kinds of people. The idea is that we will be able to then bring these two valuable independent data sets together to answer questions about what kinds of infrastructure management practices eventually produce good service for our users. And so the two main insights that I hope to draw from this kind of work. And so what I'm showing you here on the right is a graph of generated data. So the generated data is showing us one possibility of data insights we might collect, where each of these dots is a different nation. And on the x-axis, we're seeing service quality. On the y-axis, we're looking at an enabling environment factor. You might consider, let's use policy again as our easy example. And all these different colors are showing us within different sectors. And so what this data here is showing us could say something along the lines of, there's a strong positive relationship between service quality and policy in the energy sector, much stronger than in the telecom sector. That's one possibility data that we can extract from this. But we also hope that there are other kinds of insights that we might be able to capture here. The other valuable or really valuable piece that I see coming from this is if we're able to do this kind of analysis or this survey on a regular interval every 2 years or so, we could track at a national level which countries or which nations are investing in different kinds of non-physical infrastructure management or infrastructure resilience. And that over time will really incentivize or allow individual nations or individual utilities to really put into practice and make better decisions around infrastructure management. So I'm just having a look at our time here. We do have a couple notes on our implementation that I wanted to share with you. Thus far, our implementation process has been an iterative design approach for the survey. That is, we designed the survey and we have been testing it with our colleagues. We tested it with our expert advisory group, got a lot of fantastic feedback from that. And our advisory group is made up of 20 global specialists who each individually have specializations in different infrastructure sectors or surveys of this kind, or even just survey design. And they've given us a lot of feedback on how we can improve the survey, areas that make the survey stronger or easier to take. And through our survey process, we've identified 7 pilot countries across the globe that we're interested in, that we are in fact piloting our survey with: Chile, St. Lucia, Tajikistan, Nepal, Singapore, Japan, and Fiji. They're spread across the globe so that we have an understanding of different infrastructure contexts, different languages, and how the survey will translate, and to get an understanding of really how can we improve this before it goes global. So with all of those things, we have already engaged in our first of our pilot surveys with the country St. Lucia. And in collecting some of the insights from St. Lucia, one of the things that I realized is that I wanted to share them with you. I don't know that we have a lot of time, but I thought the results of this survey are so important when they are comparative. Individually, it does tell us useful information about any one nation, but in particular, when they're presented comparatively, we learn quite a lot. For example, when I look at the policy information that we collected from our pilot survey, we learned that in the airport sector in St. Lucia, the policies are really well defined. They include clear methods of implementation, but they do so in ways that are greater or at a better standard than other Eastern Caribbean nations. And I think that's a really important insight that actually allows, first of all, other Eastern Caribbean nations to have a look at the airport sector in St. Lucia and see which things might cross-apply, but it also might allow IGOs, groups like the World Bank and the IMF, when they invest in these countries for infrastructure, they might be able to see and identify other nations or other ways that similar nations in the region can improve. So from the side of St. Lucia, the policy, we're learning new things about how the work can be comparative, but also we're learning things about the countries and their infrastructure management that simply we didn't know before. So disaster preparedness in St. Lucia, in particular, we're learning that the government of St. Lucia hosts a disaster early warning system where they collect data and have it in a centralized location. With the exception of specific UN reports that have already looked at St. Lucia, that data isn't really widely available and certainly isn't widely available across different countries and across different regions. And so here are just a couple of the insights that we found in our pilot surveys. I think in conclusion, what I wanted to share with you is that I think that we are at the beginning of a very, very exciting process. This Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey is going to produce a novel data set and database that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's going to be hopefully useful at a national level, at an international level for making decisions, and it will support a lot of the decisions that are going to be coming out of other work like the ICDRI. I think from my end, I'm really excited to be a part of it, and I really hope that you'll be excited to be a part of it too, because certainly we'll be asking you as individuals to take the survey with us. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening, and open to any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Again, both for keeping at time and managing to pack a lot of information into a short presentation. So congratulations on that. So we're now going to basically follow the same logic as we did after Gabrielle. So I'm first of all going to ask Juliet and then Katarzyna to come in about 3 minutes each with a commentary on what you've just heard from Nicholas. Thank you. So over to you, Juliet.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you again, Nicholas. So yet again, I think my overall reflection is a hugely impressive and hugely ambitious undertaking. So congratulations, and really looking forward to seeing where this gets to. Again, I think it's going to give us some new and consistent insights at a global level. And I also wanted to congratulate CDRI for undertaking both of these projects and also for presenting them side by side, because I think that gives us a really important reflection on what we can quantify and what we can't quantify. And certainly in my work, and I'm an engineer, I work for an engineering organization. We do love to quantify what we can, and it is incredibly important. But in the space of resilience, never forgetting those aspects that we can't quantify. So not only am I excited to see both of these sets of global results, I'm also excited to see what the CDRI might do with them together, how to put those together to give a very new and clever insights. I think, again, one of my own reflections is my own learning journey work we've been doing through ARUP, delivering the resilience shift over the past 5 years is how important these non-physical, non-technical components of resilience are. We can understand the technical risks. We can't do anything about an awful lot of them without having this enabling environment. One sort of wish, something like that for Nicholas and team is not only to be capturing the data and to be able to do the analytics, but the stories I think are hugely important. And I've seen this again from the World Risk Poll. What we're all trying to do in this space is so important and quite difficult to understand. And these little stories of individuals in different countries I learned a huge amount, for example, from what the city of Cape Town had gone through when they were approaching their day zero. Suddenly the systems thinking, that everyone's role in this suddenly gets unlocked through the story. So how you might do some of that, I think that would be a wonderful complementary thing, to have some local color, local stories and real people featuring in it. But thanks. Sorry, I think I went over my time a bit, Katarzyna. Sorry, over to you.
Thanks very much, Juliet. Over to you, Katarzyna.
Thank you very much. So I also want to congratulate very much. I think it's really innovative. And I echo what Juliet said, that with this combined together, it can be an amazing insight. The work that you do with the previous resilience metrics. Listening to you, I would say that looking sometimes from the project perspective, what you were explaining and all the information you will be trying to gather, it's like a dream vulnerability assessment, because many vulnerability assessments are just about this technical, physical strength, and they are the most cared of. But real vulnerability is also the capacity of people dealing with this infrastructure to recover and to work with it, and to know what happens with this infrastructure and how to work with it. So I think having this information would be very, very useful to build such really complex vulnerability assessment that can inform interventions. And I also very much appreciate the fact that you really want to talk with non-technical people. my feeling is that sometimes I get much more insight from people that may be just users, and they may just observe things that happen around their own house that can be super insightful and help to ask right questions. So I think it can be very helpful. And finally, what is really, I think we all heard different stories that we had the investment in infrastructure, but then the maintenance was not there. And actually the quality and even the lifetime of the infrastructure planned and the realistic is much shorter. So I think capturing these responses on maintenance can be very, very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Katarzyna. So first of all, I'd just like to thank Nicholas again for his presentation and for the two panelists for your comments. I'm just going to make a brief overview, I think, of what these two initiatives mean and how they can sort of link together going forward. And then we'll move on to the next part of the session where we're going to actually field questions to each of the presenters and panelists. So I think my personal view on this, and this is after having participated in many evaluations of multilateral development bank infrastructure projects, is that the current state of play in the world is the bar is still actually really low. A lot of standards in infrastructure projects aren't actually yet based on a rigorous risk assessment. Which means obviously that questions the sort of the quality of a physical asset. Many low and middle income countries still have very, very serious governance issues in terms of planning, designing and managing their infrastructure, which often means that the infrastructure does tend to sort of degrade and become obsolete quicker than it does. I mean, the fact that many countries don't have adequate operations and maintenance budgets is a very clear issue. We still have many other issues as well. The lack of insurance. A lot of infrastructure in low middle income countries isn't insured or reinsured, which means countries have sort of financial crisis after major disasters and so on and so forth. So if the bar is low, I think these two initiatives together can really help us sort of raise the bar and hopefully raise the sort of the quality of what we're doing. The first one, which Gabrielle described, obviously is looking at the sort of, if you like, the physical resilience of infrastructure assets, but that has to be the starting point because you don't actually have indirect impacts unless you have a direct impact first. But as we've said, I mean, that's only really one side of resilience. We then need to look at whether that sort of level of resilience can be maintained over time. Is there adequate operations and maintenance? Are the systems in place to mean that services can be restored quickly? And ultimately, this then brings us down to the level of the resilience of the households, businesses, and communities that really depend on those services which the infrastructure is providing. So both of these projects have been now up and running for a few months. I think the ICDRI got going in sort of November, and with Nicholas, we've been working on the survey now for several months as well. So I think we've got this all off to a good start. And hopefully by this time next year, if in the next ICDRI, we'll be actually being able to describe results. And I think the exciting part again is how we can actually combine the physical risk metrics with let's say the non-physical resilience aspects, and see how we can make sense of that puzzle and have some maps which then actually describe to us what's going on again in every country and territory in the world. So I'll stop there. I could probably continue for another half an hour, but I don't have any. So what we're going to do is now we're going to actually field questions to each one of the presenters and participants. Now, Gabrielle has had to leave us. So the first question I'm going to field is to Mabel Marulanda, again, someone who's got a very, very long experience in probabilistic risk modeling and is currently based in Abu Dhabi. So Mabel, can you provide us with some examples from your work of how probabilistic risk metrics can encourage governments, development banks, and investors to strengthen disaster and climate resilience in new or upgraded infrastructure. So over to you, Mabel.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon, all. Good morning for some of you. Okay, so, well, as you saw in Gabriel's presentation, like the main metric that we obtain from these risk assessments is the loss exceedance curve. And from that loss exceedance curve, we can obtain different kinds of risk metrics. The two most known is the average annual loss and the probable maximum losses that are chosen for different return periods. It depends on what kind of decisions want to be taken. No, the average annual loss is a very robust metric that is it has a very low sensitivity to uncertainty. And it has been used, for example, in the insurance market. It is called the pure premium and is used to define the premiums that are taken by, for example, governments or that are established by the insurance sector for the people to pay an amount of money to protect their houses and their buildings from losses. The average annual loss is being also used as an input for the development of different indicators. One of the examples is the disaster deficit index that was developed for the Inter-American Development Bank. And what it measures is the contingent liabilities of countries. Why the Inter-American Development Bank wanted something like this? Because they could prioritize the countries to see what was the risk, what were the losses that they could have, and the gap that they could have in terms of responding if some losses were generated by a specific type of hazards. No? In the global reports in 2015, the GAR 2015 and 2017, the AEL is the most also used metric, and it is basically used to prioritize countries. No, so when you see which are the countries that have higher risk, that you can separate by hazards, you can see the different type of hazards, and it will give the possibility to see how you should enter and see in more details in the countries, more detailed evaluations, as Gabriel was showing, no? Because the arithmetic is the same. So as it is the same, it's just using more detailed data, more detailed information, and then it is possible to take different kind of decisions at national level or at local level. The same is being done in some countries in Latin America. Apart from it, the average annual loss can be also used for benefit cost analysis, as well as the loss exceedance curve or the PML curve, where you can see, for example, if you make retrofitting of a specific sector. Now that we are talking about infrastructure, no? So let's say that we talk about hospitals, and we say that we're going to retrofit all the hospitals in a city. We can see how that probable maximum loss curve is reduced, because we say we are reducing the risk of those buildings, and in those terms we are reducing the last possible losses that can occur for that. So it has many different applications. Well, that's the development of indicators and of these things is always looking for the communication to the decision makers, no? Because if we only give the curves or the numbers or things like that, it's something that is not going to be understood. So that's why sometimes we've been developing and proposing, and the field developing these other indicators that are based on the metrics, on the risk metrics, to be able to communicate. Because if they don't understand, it's going to be impossible that they base their decisions their risk-informed decisions. I don't know if you have something else.
Okay, thank you very much, Mabel. I think that's a very comprehensive set of reflections on that particular question. So we really thank you for that. I'm now going to field the second question to Professor Jim Paul from the University of Oxford. So Jim, what sort of governance arrangements should countries put in place to ensure that disaster and climate resilience is planned, financed, managed, and above all maintained? How important are factors such as standards and norms, institutional quality, operations and maintenance, and risk information in ensuring disaster and climate resilience? So again, that's about 15 questions for you to answer in 5 minutes. So over to you, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and let me thank and congratulate Nicholas Chow for presenting the development that he's been working so hard on in the Resilience Survey. The second part of your question was why are these factors which we're seeking to explore in the survey so important? And actually in the feedback that we had both from Juliette and from Katarzyna after Nicholas's presentation, I think they really underlined and said more eloquently than I can why these enabling environment factors around standard of design and construction, operation and maintenance, emergency repair and recovery, and the whole overarching institutional framework is so important for infrastructure systems resilience. It's important, and it's very tricky to pin down, difficult or if not impossible to quantify. I hope that we'll learn a lot from this survey. I take Juliette's point too, that we learn a lot from narratives, from examples, from case studies, how we assimilate all of that information into a national scale or indeed global picture, I think is really challenging, but really important. But what the first part of your question was more normative. It was, what should we do about these things? From the survey, we'll learn about what is going on. I think the design of the survey kind of already implicitly contains some intuitions in terms of the way in which this should be done. And these are lessons that have been learned and relearned by many people around the world. And let me just kind of skip through some of those institutional factors and what good looks like from a kind of upstream to downstream perspective. So by upstream, I'm thinking about the upstream frameworks for national infrastructure planning, and this usually is done at national scales. And then possibly also subnational planning and locational decisions, leading into decisions about initiating projects. And we know, looking around the world, that, or maybe I hesitate to say that we know, but what I think this community likes the look of is strategic approaches, national overarching bodies, which are able to develop a long-term view, which to some extent is at least partially immune from the vagaries of the political cycle, and recognizes the changing nature of infrastructure needs in a country, how those needs might evolve through time, and looks ahead in a very strategic way, also recognizing the role of uncertainty in order to develop national infrastructure strategies. And as I say, I think whether that approach is the solution is for now an untested hypothesis, but we're on the other hand, we see situations where that type of solution is not being applied, where infrastructure decisions are highly politically motivated. They're taken and then reversed. They're taken at short notice. They're taken without attention to interdependencies, and really without a strategic view of a country's infrastructure needs. And I think that is we can say quite confidently is wasteful and counterproductive. Thinking about resilience, that's absolutely crucial to get this embedded at those early stages in the infrastructure planning process. Questions around where infrastructure is located spatially are amongst the most important from a resilience perspective. And those types of decisions, where a project will be, are often become baked in really early on in the project preparation life cycle, before questions of resilience have been properly thought through. So I think that that's also extremely important. And then as one goes into project preparation, one needs to make sure that questions of climate and other natural disaster related risk are clearly embedded within that, are valued and communicated to the finance sector, and then lead into procurement processes which focus on the quality aspects of infrastructure, which are so crucial for resilience alongside the questions of cost. Just skipping downstream through this process very quickly in the construction, that requires capable contractors and good supervision. Operation and maintenance has been referred to on several occasions already, in particular the need for preventative maintenance regimes, as well as having systems in place that for repair and recovery, for disaster risk recovery, including financial mechanisms so that finance can be mobilized, possibly through contingency funds, possibly through risk pools and catastrophe bonds, which enable countries to recover, because we know from our risk analysis of the wider economic impacts of infrastructure failure that the duration of failure is absolutely fundamental in terms of the macroeconomic impacts of infrastructure failures. So getting those mechanisms in place for rapid repair, reinstatement and recovery is very much part of the process as well. I could say more, but hopefully that gets the conversation going.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim, for those, I think, insights onto the sort of links between governance, infrastructure governance in particular, and resilience. So we'll now move on to Juliet again from Arup. Arup's obviously a big player in doing infrastructure projects. So the question for Juliet is, how will the transition to net zero economies shape future infrastructure investment? Will the rollout of new technologies such as green energy provide new opportunities for strengthening resilience? How will countries address the issue of stranded assets in legacy infrastructure sectors? So that's three, I guess, slightly different but highly interconnected questions for you to reflect on, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And yeah, I'm pleased you asked those questions, because it does bring this discussion into what Arup's key role is, which is delivering these infrastructure projects. And I think reflecting, so firstly, your first part of the question was about how the transition to net zero shapes future infrastructure investment. I'm really pleased to bring net zero into this as well, because we're often at risk of going down one part of the problem or the other. So either how we get to net zero or how we become more resilient to disasters. And permanently in our work at Arup, whatever the question from our clients is, bringing those two sides of the climate challenge together. I think one thing that's exciting for Arup and all our sort of colleagues and other engineering companies is the the investment that will be unlocked by net zero, it will move us towards the projects that we want to deliver, the future direction of our firm, investment that's actively seeking this sort of pipeline of green sustainable infrastructure. I think alongside that, this investment does and needs to generate like urgency for all of us to build resilience into this. Again, I think there is a risk that we deliver all this green, low carbon, net zero infrastructure, and it's not resilient, and then we've failed in what we're trying to achieve, and we've only got one chance to do that. And I think probably the final part of the question, how will the transition shape future infrastructure investment? And Jim, I think, picked up on this. We don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty about what's happening. So we need to build in all of these things that we've been considering, the understanding the hazard and risk, understanding the governance, and just move ourselves towards the right direction, but never assume that we know exactly what the future is going to look like. I think related to that, the second sort of side of that question was, will the rollout of new technologies provide new opportunities for strengthening resilience? I think yes, it can and it should, but again, we shouldn't assume that that's automatic. There are, technologies can be rolled out that are at risk of compromising resilience. And examples might be increased use of digital technology brings in new fragilities related to cybersecurity and cyber resilience. So again, I think ensuring that resilience thinking is built in to the introduction of new technologies. I guess it's worth reflecting that green energy on its own isn't automatically more resilient. Again, it's on us to sort of ensure that it is. There are aspects of green energy. It takes away it has the potential to take away some of the supply chain affordability challenges that we're certainly seeing in many parts of the world at the moment. I think there's a risk for all of us in the period of transition from where we are now to the future where we are, much more fully in a green energy world, and how we stay on that transition when there's always shocks and stresses in a very sort of real, immediate thing, again, such as any energy prices in many parts of the world at the moment. The final part of your question, Andrew, was about how countries address the issues of stranded assets in legacy infrastructure sectors. On that one, I think the first part is to know, through everything that's been presented, through understanding the risk, the governance and the physical risk, to know where those stranded assets are. Again, I think we remain at risk now of building new infrastructure, of locking in more stranded assets. And that's probably step one of our problem. How we address these issues once we know where they are, that's a really exciting place for Arup. That's where we can start to become creative and use innovative design solutions, how we might repurpose existing networks, how we can retrofit existing buildings. That bit, I think, circular economy type thinking, I'm almost not so worried about that as how we collectively stop introducing even more stranded assets into the system. It's around making decisions now that we're not going to regret in 5-10 years time, whether that's related to technology, related to other energy sources that are not low or zero carbon. Hopefully I've covered at least part of your questions there, Andrew. There was a lot in there to tackle.
Let me just unmute. So thanks very much, Juliet, for that. Yes, I mean, each of these questions could have given rise to a 45 minutes presentation and debate. But I mean, what the takeaway from yours, particularly what you said at the end, is really, I think I could summarize it by saying, if you want to get out of the hole, stop digging. So on that, I'll now move on to the fourth question. So this is for Katarzyna from the Green Climate Fund. And coming from the Green Climate Fund, you're obviously in a very, very good position to talk to us a little bit about the role of climate finance in strengthening resilience. So how can we really strengthen the climate finance flow for systemic solutions in climate resilient infrastructure? And what sort of incentives are required to ensure that both the public and private sector invest in resilience. And again, it's maybe sounds simple, but there's actually quite a lot in those, packed into those two questions for you to reflect on. So Katarzyna, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, very much. So you mean I have 2 hours now to explain?
Well, I think actually we're already slightly over time, but I think you have about 6 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So where to start, to be clear, is maybe we are very often thinking about finance for many different types of solutions for development, for climate change, for resilient infrastructure. If we look at investors being both public and private, if we ask them one question, what would make them come with their finance, they would say that first and foremost, sound projects. As simple as it sounds, of course, the devil is in the detail. So we can see in climate finance for especially our topic today for resilient infrastructure, that would be really the same case. So once you see that the projects are coming and are sound from maybe one jurisdiction, then many financials will look for financing it, or it will be very easy to make a pitch and make them reflow the money into new types of projects. Now, in case of resilient infrastructure and climate adaptation overall, we talk about quite complex structure. So it's first of all integrated in the sense that, of course, we have a lot of interdependencies. Therefore, for making a good water infrastructure project, especially with a climate context, you may not be enough to think about resilience of the assets, but you will really have to look at the overall watershed system in the functional area and then decide what has to be done. So this is the systemic approach that is really in climate super important to build the sound projects, because it's the first technical step to de-risk projects. Then it's actually the process to which you have to have a right climate data, right tools, this high-level tools that can bring down climate data and certain analysis and mapping. Some of them we talked about today. But then you start structuring the projects. And of course, again, it will not be one project. It will be a pipeline that is integrated and addresses the functional area or the systems and the intersections. You will still look for phasing, what is the most important and what is the less important, but still it will keep the pipeline. So you can say that within the several years, this is what we can achieve, and the overall resilience would be this level. In the most cases, one asset resilience will not give you systemic resilience of having, let's say, water in the tap for the community. And this is the technical soundness of projects that is decisive for risk mitigation for financial sector, equally for public as private. Now, whatever is remaining as inability technically, because we talk about probabilistic approach to climate change, we are never sure. We have to choose certain scenarios. We have to choose our return periods. So finally, we have a limit to make technically sound project and to promise to the investor that will be working exactly the way we explained. And here is where you come with the financial. So once you know how your projects look like, you can actually look for concessionality, the cost of capital, and fueling additional public finance to motivate private to come. But I think it's very important to say that it happens only at this level. So you have to understand your pipeline, understand where the risks are remaining that shall be taken by financial risk mitigation factors. And if we can do this, if we can promote this integrated project pipeline approach, it also mitigates a lot of political risk because it will be pitched by the country, by the government. So it gives much less on the burden of the political risk. Therefore, overall risk and interest from both public and private will come. And now what may be important is that we also need this project pipeline to actually assess how much public finance should come. Because then we may crowd out private finance because maybe we go too high on concessional finance. That's why it all brings us to the good balance in which we can gather both public and private. So I would say that these are the major issues that have to be taken into account. And I think one of the important elements that need to be addressed is that we may go away from mobilizing finance before understanding the types of projects that will come. This very often happens. And how it ends? It ends in the way that you gather especially private investors and you predefine concessionality level. So you predefine what they might be satisfied to finance and to what extent of risk they could see they can come. If you come from this perspective, so the back end, and then you look for projects, the problem is that very often you will punish a lot of jurisdictions because they may need, like SIDS countries, they may need much higher concessionality. Therefore, starting from the point of mobilizing finance by investors and then predefining indicators for projects can be really difficult to cover the most vulnerable countries with the finance that can flow to them because the sound projects can convince to do so. So that's from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katarzyna. That's a great set of answers to, again, a set of complex questions. For the last part of the session now, I mean, we've actually got about 12 minutes left. And I've received around, I think, 7 or 8 different questions from the audience. Now, if we try and answer 8 questions in 12 minutes, we're not actually going to get very far. So I'm going to use my moderator's privilege to actually select some questions and field those to the appropriate people. So I'm actually going to start off with Nicholas and Jim. And this is a question from someone called Ashwani Kumar. So does the country's level of economic development influence the risk perception of government and individual experts? And if yes, how is that taken into account in actually calibrating the survey results? So over to you, Nicholas and Jim. I mean, whichever either or both of you would like to answer the question.
You're leaving us with an invidious negotiation to do online without any means of communication. So let me I'll be very quick and then hand over to Nicholas briefly. The answer is yes. This is a subjective survey, and people's baselines with respect to what they consider to be tolerable or intolerable risks is conditioned by a whole bunch of things. We know that from the risk communication literature, by their own experiences, so the accessibility of disasters they've previously been involved in, by the media, by their own expectations. And so we can't do a great deal about that. I think what people say to us is nonetheless important. It has to be recognized as being subject to those particular contextual biases, but I think it's still valuable to us. And I think we can apply some level of objectivity, looking across to the ICDRI and other risk information, that there is some objective information about the frequency of disasters, both from models and from observations. And so that perhaps provides us with some information to contextualize people's perceptions in different countries. Nicholas.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jim. I I would have to agree the survey is inherently subjective, but I do think that we will be asking questions of individuals that allow us to contextualize their experiences with infrastructure within their nation in particular, or even within their administrative region. So we will be collecting data that lets us understand the socioeconomics of the respondents, but also within that nation or region, recognizing that every nation and region might have a different level of development. When we cross-compare that information across these different nations, the metrics that we'll be using will be relative. And so countries that have a higher level of development, they might respond as having some different or higher level of resilience proportional to their sort of level of development. And we will also be including that, hopefully, in our final analyses.
Great, thanks very much, Nick, and thanks, Jim. So a question now for Mabel and Gabrielle, which by default now means a question for Mabel because Gabrielle is no longer with us. Again, from Ashwani Kumar. And I think if I understand the question correctly is, how does the sort of the GIRI, the risk model and the index take into account the fact that countries have completely different hazard patterns? I mean, so obviously some countries, it's mainly earthquake risk, in some it's mainly going to be flood risk, in some it's mainly going to be drought risk. So how are the different sort of hazard models taken into account or unified in a single risk metric? Mabel, can you reflect on that for us?
Yes. Well, all the hazards that apply to the different countries are included. The hazards that are included in the global risk assessment are going to be included, because the results, as I was saying before, are the loss exceedance curve. They have the same data, no? So you can combine the information from, for example, earthquakes and tropical cyclones and droughts and all these things, no? Because what we have is the frequency of the events and the exceedance of the losses by those that frequency, no? Like it's like the exceedance loss. That's why it is called the loss exceedance curve, and that is why it is possible to combine all the hazards into one single curve. At the same time, the results can be presented like they can be split in the different hazards, and for example, countries that are in the middle of the continent, that they don't have access to the sea and they don't have cyclones. So basically, the risk because of cyclones is going to be zero. And that is why we have to take into account not only the multi-hazard risk assessment, where we have like all the results from the different hazards, but also separate them to see which is the hazard that gives like more, like represents more risk to the countries, no? Because there, as you said, or as it is in the question, there are some countries that have like higher risk because of earthquakes, but other countries have because of droughts or because of tropical cyclones. So that's why it is important to separate them and to see which is the hazard that can give like the highest numbers.
Okay, thank you very much, Mabel. So I think it's 5 minutes before the end of the session. I know we've only managed to answer 2 of the 7 questions from the audience, but I'm being asked now by the organizers to sort of wrap up. So first of all, I'd just like to thank all of the speakers. So Gabrielle and Nicholas in particular, I think you got us off to a great start to the session. And I think both, the people on the panel, as well as hopefully the broader audience, can see really the sort of immense potential of what we're doing here with these 2 very, very, very complementary exercises. I think this is going to take, let's say, the sort of the base level, understood as a sort of global public good, up to another level of information. So hopefully, again, this can then feed into both the sort of, design of infrastructure projects, the sort of information available to investors, as well as helping multilateral organizations like GCF, as well as the different multilateral development banks, have information to sort of establish priorities and work on really what are the risks. Because clearly our understanding in terms of financing for resilient infrastructure is actually, without understanding the risks, investors are often very reluctant to sort of step in, particularly from the private sector. So I'd also then like to thank Juliet and Katarzyna. I mean, again, I think bringing in the perspective of a major infrastructure provider like Arup is fundamental. And again, an organization like GCF, which is key now in providing climate finance. We know this is going to play a very important role in actually kickstarting a lot of the resilience efforts in infrastructure projects in the future. So I hope this has been a session that gives us, let's say, a glimpse of what's coming in the future. And that by this time next year, we'll be able to, actually discuss results and what these means for different countries and territories around the world. And indeed what they mean actually for the sort of policies that banks, funds, governments, and the private sector should be put in place as we move forward. So from that, I'll again thank all the speakers and panelists. Thanks ICDRI for the opportunity to present you today. We're obviously joining you from around the world, from I think Jamaica actually for two of the people on the screen. Myself in Costa Rica, Juliet in London, Mabel in Abu Dhabi, and Nick in Oxford, and Gabriel was in Bogota. So we're really a very international group. And I've been asked to remind people who are following this that this is the end of the sessions for today in Studio 2, which is where we are. The last session of this first day of the ICDRI is a featured event in Studio 1 that starts at 7 p.m. Indian time, and is titled United States Government Engagement and Delivery of Disaster-Resilient Infrastructure Around the World. So those of you who would like to follow that, you have to leave Studio 2 and check in to Studio 1. So thank you again very much, everyone. And that's all for me for today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for having us. Thank you. Take care, everyone.